So what's wrong with de facto relationships? Introduction.
The choices we make as adults and parents are either improving the prospects for our children or leaving them with a world in a worse condition than the one we inherited from our parents. So many of the problems we face today in our modern society are repercussions of the failings of previous generations. Decisions made decades ago continue to have far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences. Sadly, this can now be observed in the widespread breakup of the traditional family structure within our society. In my previous teaching, Why Do We Need DadsUni?, I looked at the results that came from the social changes of the 1960s and 1970s. I identified both the decline in established moral and ethical values and the subsequent rise of the women's liberation movement as being the main contributing factors in the destabilization of our civilization. Please understand that this teaching is not being written to shame those currently living in de facto relationships, but to identify a lifestyle choice that, in my opinion, hinders rather than strengthens the social fabric of our Western society.
A changing world.
When I grew up in the 1960s, Australian society seemed more stable, and family life felt more secure and dependable. Very few of my friends from school came from single-parent or divorced homes, and Australians were still shocked and outraged when the news reported that there had been a murder committed somewhere within our nation. Unfortunately, these days, those scenarios are all too common in our society, and are often even accepted now as the norm. It was a different time, with differing values, and a greater sense of community and personal responsibility than we have today. It was culturally expected that young people showed respect to their elders, stood and gave seats to women while traveling on the bus or train, and many people opened doors for others merely out of a sense of courtesy. These behaviors were instilled into my generation and assigned under the heading of being just good manners. Unfortunately, many of the decisions that were made by my generation as they sought greater moral freedoms have eroded the very foundations that made our society strong and have destabilized the structures that supported the family unit.
A changing lifestyle.
In Australia at that time, there were major changes in the standards of acceptable behavior within our society. The behavioral constraints that previous generations had accepted as social norms were abandoned by much of this generation and replaced by a lifestyle best described as being morally relative, where if it feels good, do it. These social changes were also accepted by the government of the time as the new standard, and de facto relationships became the way many young couples began their life together. This arrangement may have seemed to be a smarter way to find out if a relationship would last before taking the next step of getting married, but brought with it a wide range of problems and repercussions, many of which are still being experienced today. Thankfully, we are not obliged to persist with mistakes of the past. Each of us can choose today whether we want to continue the downward spiral of Western society or take personal responsibility and make a difference within our communities. The choice is ours as today's adults and parents.
A changing legal status.
Legally, the breakup of de facto relationships is now seen as similar to marriage and often incurs the same costs as those who are being divorced. These costs often run into tens of thousands of dollars in disputed settlements. When children are involved and custody is being contested, the financial outlay can escalate considerably, and unfortunately, the emotional cost to the family can be even more catastrophic. Listed below are just some of the specific problems that come with de facto relationships. Statistically speaking, de facto relationships are 6 times more likely to break up than a couple who is married without living together first. The try before you buy mentality, fails to realize that many people decide not to get married and continue in an unstable relationship. This unfortunately affects not only themselves, but any children that may result from the union. After 2 years in a de facto relationship, the legal commitments concerning property settlements, etc., are the same as those within a traditional marriage. The children of de facto relationships often have different last names to that of their parents' current partner, and this can lead to a sense of insecurity about identity and acceptance within the family. The children of de facto relationships are still seen within many communities as being illegitimate and suffer socially from this perception. In light of these problems, it could easily be surmised that society in general has suffered, rather than benefited, from my generation's acceptance and adoption of the widespread practice of living within de facto relationships. It has been 50 years since those fundamental changes in society took place, and we are now reaping the results of generations of children who don't know who they are and what their responsibilities in society should be. There is, however, an even more important question that we should be asking ourselves.
So should we continue choosing man's ideas or search for God's wisdom?
The question I would ask my readers today is the same one I ask about many issues we increasingly seem to have to face in our modern society, and that question is, what does God think about this? To find the answer on God's views on this and many other subjects, we need to look no further than the pages of God's revelation of His will to mankind, found in the Bible. 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 16 to 17. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. When Jesus was asked by the religious leaders of the time about his views on marriage and divorce, his answer both surprised and upset many of them, as they also had been living in ways that were contrary to what God had commanded. Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 to 9. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." Jesus taught that God's design was for mankind to have only one sexual partner, and that in their union they became one flesh, a lifelong physical and spiritual bond. The marriage covenant was instituted by God to establish and strengthen both family and society.
Jesus and the Samaritan woman.
In this story, found in the Gospel of John chapter 4, Jesus and his disciples were traveling on foot from Judea and toward Galilee. On the way they needed to pass through Samaria, and so around midday they came into a town called Sychar. Sychar was a notable town in Samaria, as it was the place where Jacob's well had been dug by one of the patriarchs. Jesus' disciples had left him at the well to rest while they went into Sychar to obtain some food for lunch. And it is here that we see Jesus meeting and discussion with the Samaritan woman who had come to draw water from the well. Even in this time and culture, there were social issues around an unmarried woman living with a man, and this is attested to by the time that this Samaritan woman had to come to the well. Most of the women from the town arrived at the well early in the day, before the sun grew hot and drew the water they needed. However, we see that this particular Samaritan woman for some reason arrived at the well at the hottest time of the day, avoiding the negative social interactions with the more respectable women of the town. We also see that the Samaritan woman, when she understood that Jesus was the promised Messiah, ran back into town and spoke only to the men of the city about him, and not the women. John chapter 4 verses 16 to 18. Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered and said, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." Jesus in this story indicates that the men that this woman had been living with throughout her life had the status and benefits of a husband, but they lacked the responsibility and commitment required in marriage. Please note that at no time did Jesus judge or condemn the Samaritan woman for her lifestyle, but neither did he shy away from shining the light of truth into her heart. By speaking the truth in love, Jesus was able to gently direct this precious woman back into God's pathway for her life.
So what are God's thoughts on de facto relationships and marriage?
In God's judgment, there's no such thing as de facto relationships. Relationships outside of the covenant of marriage are clearly described either as fornication or adultery. Fornication being the description of those in a sexual relationship having never been married, and adultery being those in a sexual relationship with someone other than the person that they married. Both of these behaviors are now widely accepted and practiced within our modern society, but fail to live up to the standards that God Himself has set. Many behaviors that are legally acceptable in modern society are seen as wrong and sinful in the sight of our holy God. Genesis chapter 2 verse 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. When relationships break up, there is often a very high level of emotional pain involved for both parties, and this situation is made even worse when there are children involved as well. God didn't want His children to suffer this, and so made a way for human beings to enjoy the benefits of married life without the suffering involved in breakups or divorce. The way God established to protect both individuals and the family unit was through covenant marriage. A covenant is a solemn vow and commitment, and within marriage, it is a commitment to stay married and continue to work through the challenges of life together as a team until they are parted by death, no matter what.
The Christian marriage difference.
A marriage that is Christ-centered, being based upon the wisdom of the Scriptures and God's love and spirit of service within the family unit, is a foundation that can survive through the storms of life and shine as a light into our communities.
In a Christian marriage,
both the husband and wife are in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Their marriage is built upon the wisdom found within the Bible. These include mutual respect, defined roles, a spirit of servanthood, teamwork, living together in the love and fear of God. Their marriage is built upon covenant commitment, not merely feelings or lust. For further study on this subject, you may choose to read my earlier teachings. The benefits of traditional marriage, or the benefits of fidelity. Jesus Christ said in Matthew chapter 7 verses 24 to 27, "Therefore whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall."
Final encouragement.
If we want our homes and families to survive the many challenges that life brings, we can do no better than listen and obey Jesus' wisdom and make sure that they are being built securely on God's Word. God bless. John Nolan, DadsUni.
The Ministry of DadsUni.
DadsUni is an online ministry based in Australia and is focused on providing simple biblical teaching to assist young men in growing families God's way. All DadsUni resources are provided free of charge, and we encourage those who enjoy our teachings to share them freely among family and friends. DadsUni can be found online in the following locations: Facebook, DadsUni; Instagram, DadsUni; YouTube @DadsUni; website, dadsuni.com; Google Playbooks, author John Nolan. We hope you enjoyed this teaching and will visit DadsUni online regularly to see our latest blogs and updates.